Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, requires employers to evaluate the workplace to determine if any spaces are permit-required confined spaces. This is essentially a two-step process. Step 1, identify all of your confined spaces, and Step 2, determine which of those confined spaces are permit-required, and conversely, which ones are not. The focus of this tutorial is on OSHA's definition of a confined space. Employers must evaluate all confined spaces in the workplace even if they do not have employees who will be entering those spaces. Also, the permit-required confined space standard does not require documentation of this evaluation. However, it may be a good idea. So what is OSHA's definition of a confined space? The OSHA definition of a confined space can be found at 1910-146 paragraph B, definitions. There you will see that confined spaces are characterized by three criteria. It is important to note that all three criteria must be in place for a space to be considered a confined space. Also, keep in mind that whether or not a hazard is present inside the space is not relevant at this point. You are only trying to identify confined spaces. The first criteria listed in OSHA's definition of a confined space is the space is large enough and so configured that an employee can bodily enter and perform assigned work. The operative term is bodily enter. This means that the employee can fit entirely inside the space. If the space is not large enough for the employee to fit entirely inside, then the space does not meet the definition of a confined space. This standard is only intended to apply to spaces large enough and configured so the entire body of an employee can enter. This is clarified in the preamble to the final rule. The second criteria in OSHA's definition of a confined space is the space has limited or restricted means for entry or exit. Contrary to popular belief, this does not mean that the space has only one way in or out. It means the entrance ability to escape in an emergency would be hindered. Further explanation of this term is provided by OSHA in the preamble to the final rule. And in the OSHA Confined Space Advisor, they further explain that a space would have a limited means of entry or exit where the occupant must crawl, climb, twist, be constrained in a narrow opening, follow a lengthy path, or otherwise exert unusual effort to enter or leave, or where the entrance may become sealed or secured against opening from inside. Examples of a limited or restricted means of entry or exit could include portholes, where the entrant must squeeze through to enter or exit, hatches of a size or location that require the entrant to climb or squeeze through, manhole openings that the entrant must pass through to get into or out of the space, and entryways where the worker must climb a ladder to enter or exit the space. Spiral stairways, which are difficult to climb or descend. Steep stairways, such as ship's ladders and other non-standard stairways. Tight crawl spaces, such as beneath equipment, under floors, between walls, and above some ceilings. And enclosed spaces where the worker must travel a long distance to get to the means of exit. The question often arises as to whether or not OSHA considers a standard-sized doorway to be a limited or restricted means of entry or exit. In the preamble to the Permit-Required Confined Space Standard, OSHA states that doorways and other portals through which a person can walk are not to be considered a limited means of entry or exit. However, a space containing such a door or portal may still be deemed a confined space if an entrant's ability to escape in an emergency would be hindered. OSHA further clarifies their position in a later amendment published in the Federal Register, where they state that even if the door or portal of a space is of sufficient size, obstructions inside the space could make entry into or exit from the space difficult. The agency intended that spaces which otherwise meet the definition of a confined space and which have obstructed entry or exits, even though the portal is a standard-sized doorway, be classified as confined spaces. The third and final criteria listed in OSHA's definition of a confined space is the space is not designed for continuous employee occupancy. For example, this particular utility vault has not been designed with any safeguards for entrance, so at a minimum, workers would have to utilize a portable blower, auxiliary lighting, and a portable gas detector before entering this space. On the other hand, this fully functioning submarine is designed for continuous employee occupancy, so it would not be considered a confined space. So in review, here is a recap of the three criteria listed in OSHA's definition of a confined space. Number 1, the space is large enough and so configured that an employee can bodily enter and perform assigned work. And number 2, the space has limited or restricted means for entry or exit. And number 3, the space is not designed for continuous employee occupancy. As a reminder, all three criteria must be present for the space to be considered a confined space. We will now look at some examples of confined spaces. However, you must keep in mind that while these are confined spaces, they may not be permit-required confined spaces. That will be determined at a later time using additional criteria. Tanks of many configurations are considered confined spaces, as are most silos and similarly constructed storage bins. Air handler units and associated equipment are often constructed of a size and configuration that make them a confined space, as would be any ductwork large enough to be bodily entered. Many smokestacks are confined spaces, as would be many chimneys. And escalator pits of a size large enough for the employee to bodily enter would also be considered confined spaces. Some mixers, such as this mobile concrete mixing drum, are confined spaces, as are many types of boilers. Large furnaces and associated equipment often qualify as confined spaces, as do tanks affixed to trailers or to rail cars. And many trash compactors are configured to be confined spaces, as are some material balers. And as previously mentioned, many crawl spaces beneath floors and equipment, between walls, and above some ceilings are considered confined spaces as well. Most sanitary sewer systems are confined spaces, as are sewer lift stations and digesters. Some storm drains and culverts are confined spaces, as are many septic tanks, utility vaults, and pipelines of various sizes. One commonly overlooked type of confined space is dock levelers of the variety that have a front cover that lifts to where a worker could crawl inside. And as previously mentioned, some utility tunnels could be considered confined spaces, as would be some attic spaces and open-top pits. And many conveyor tunnels are confined spaces, as are some elevator pits. These are but a few examples of confined spaces that are present in some workplaces, and there are many that we have not identified in this short tutorial. So you are encouraged to use your knowledge of the OSHA definition of a confined space to identify all of the confined spaces present in your workplace, as this is the first step you will need to take so you can determine which are permit-required confined spaces and conversely which ones are not.